everyone, so in today's video we're going to be learning about solving simultaneous equations. Today in this particular segment of the video I'm focusing mainly on what the objectives are and introducing the concept of simultaneous equations. So first of all, today's objectives are as follows. We want to be able to identify a pair of simultaneous equations. We're dealing with linear equations in particular, so definitely look out for the linear type, which means that we are not dealing with any variables raised to a power higher than 1. Solving a pair of simultaneous equations using one of the algebraic methods outlined, which would be the elimination and substitution methods. Then finally, when we get our solution, we want to make sure that we can validate what we have as correct. So we want to use the process of substitution to validate a solution. In today's lesson, because it's algebra, there are a few things that you definitely want to brush up on before you actually venture into the lesson. If you're okay and you want to take a look at what we're doing and then go revise, feel free. But I'll list out the entire set of pre-knowledge in the description below, so take a look at that just in case you want to make sure that you're on the right track. For today's lesson, you want to be familiar with LCM, you want to be familiar with algebraic equations, solving various types of algebraic equations, including one-step, two-step, and multi-step equations. You want to be able to simplify algebraic expressions, including those involving brackets, so you want to be familiar with distributive law as well. Of course, for algebra, you want to be familiar with integers, and as I mentioned, the process of substitution, you want to make sure that you are comfortable to do the substitution process using any algebraic expression. If you're comfortable with all of these things, you can proceed right ahead. If not, you want to brush up before you continue, it's all up to you. But let's get into what simultaneous equations are about. So our lesson today on simultaneous equations, one of the most common ideas that comes to my mind when I think about real-life applications would be in a case where you have two objects moving towards the same point. So you can think of something like two vehicles going to the same point, probably moving in opposite directions like illustrated in this image. Sometimes you may be trying to estimate the arrival time or the points of arrival, and in some applications like navigation, aviation, those things are very critical. So the use of simultaneous equations would be to model the movement of one object versus the other and see where those two may coincide. There are some other real-life applications, so definitely when we're finished with doing these methods algebraically, we're going to look at how they apply to some real-world scenarios and apply to worded problems. So make sure that you're very much confident and able to use these processes as we go through today's lesson. Now, let's talk about solving simultaneous equations. And we're not going to get into each method just yet, but I want you to be able to recognize a pair of simultaneous equations. Simultaneous equations can look something like this. And these two equations happen to be linear equations, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction. These linear equations, they have variables raised to power of 1. So there's not going to be a variable in any of these problems that we're looking at higher than 1. The next thing that you want to pay attention to, we don't have just one equation but two equations. And whenever we have an equation in more than one unknown, we need to have two equations for us to be able to solve for those unknowns, hence simultaneous equations. So the word simultaneous indicates to us that it's occurring at the same time. So these two equations solution will satisfy both equations at the same time. When we look at the pair of simultaneous equations even closer, we must be able to see that both equations have the same variables. Only two variables, but they must be the same pair of variables in both equations. So notice we have x in both of these equations as well as y. So this is how we know This system of equations belongs to a pair of simultaneous equations. Along with being able to recognize and distinguish our variables, we want to be able to recognize coefficients and constants, because these are critical and part of our elimination process, which we will be discussing first. So, if you think you've grasped the idea of what a system of simultaneous equations can look like, you can be sure to tune into the next video to get started with the processes that we use to solve simultaneous equations. And if you want to go brush up on those little areas that I mentioned earlier in the introduction, feel free before you get started. Until next video, where we will be doing the elimination method, this is the end of this particular session on what a system of simultaneous equations will look like.